So let's continue where we left. Now let's have the practical implementation of microservices with them. So identifying the service using DDD. So we already know. So DDD को use करके हम services को identify कर सकते हैं. Now here we are taking the example of institute management system. So your domain is education or training institute trainings. So you can identify the subdomain from this, like student management, course management, admission or enrollment, fees management, fees payment, attendance, faculty, sessions, certification. So you can identify such subdomains from this particular domain. Now, for every subdomain we create one or more services. That depends how large is your subdomain. So how large is your subdomain? So on which it depends. So whether how many services we create. Now, as per our subdomain, so what we can do, we can create a student service, we can create a course service, enrollment service or admission service or fees or payment service, we can say attendance service, faculty service. So we can create such services. So this identification can be happened using DDD. Now, next thing that we'll do is we define the bounded context. So we'll create a separate context for every service. So student service will have the student context, course service will have the course context, enrollment service will have the enrollment context, and payment service will have the payment context of that. Now, student, why we are creating a separate context for student or course there. So when we say student, that means it will have entire information of the student. So student related things that like profile information. Now, enrollment service will have the it will need the student information as well as course information. So payment service, so fees we can say status for that. Now, separate context for every service. And why we are creating a separate context? Every service will have a separate context, separate entities, and we can call models them in separate database because we want the services to be independent from each other. Now, so define the responsibilities of service boundaries. Now, this is your bounded context. Now, service boundaries. So you need in service boundaries, we define the responsibilities of the every service. So हर service का हम responsibility define करेंगे. For example, in a student service, so we can manage the student profile or we can manage the contact details of them. Now, should not handle fees or enrollment. So your student service will have the student responsibilities. So it should not manage the, it will not handle the, we can say fees and enrollment of them. Now, enrollment service will manage the so student course mapping and admission logic. So enrollment service should have the student course mapping and admission logic. And it should not manage the payment or personal data of the student. Now, payment service will manage the fees collection or payment status, should not manage, modify student profile or the course information. So the golden rule is one service, one responsibility. So you can define the service boundaries like this. Now let's create the first microservice. So student service. So student service को हम implement करेंगे. Now student service responsibility: register the student, get student details, update student details, or delete student or modify student. So these are the responsibilities of your student service. So that are the service we can say service boundaries for your we can say student service. Now student service will have its own database student data. Now to implement the student service, so we need to use some application architecture. So you can use the clean architecture or even driven, you can use the architecture. So we can use the event driven architecture. So you can use the architecture. So here we are using a clean architecture. So clean architecture को use कर रहे हैं. Now let's have a small overview of a clean architecture. So clean architecture also called as onion architecture. So it will have the layers. Now, so it will have the multiple, we can say, slices just like your onion. So clean architecture is designed to keep the business logic at the center of the application. Now, clean architecture will help you to keep the business logic at the center of the application, which is completely independent from external factors like database, framework, or UI. Now, why is such kind of thing with that? Because over a period, database technology got changed, your frameworks got changed, your UI technology got changed. So, but the business will remain same. So if you do not make your separate your business rules from this particular, we can say things of that, so what will happen? So every time a database technology changes or we can say backend framework changes or UI framework changes, you need to rewrite the business logical. So you need to test the business logical. So that is the main, we can say, key factor of your clean architecture. Now, core philosophy dependency rule. The most important rule in a clean architecture is the dependencies only point inwards. So when we create the slices in a clean architecture, so the dependencies will point to inward. The inner layer that the business will do not know anything about the outer layers, so database or the web. So the inner layer that is your, we can say, business rules will not know about outer rules like database or web. Changes in database, SQL or MongoDB or UI, MVC or Blazor should never force us to change your business logic for them. So it should not force to change your business logic. To implement this, you should create a, so let's implement it step by step. Now, before going to implement it step by step, so if you look at pictorially, so it will have like this. So at the core, it will have the domain, then it will have your application, and then we have the layer where we can have presentation and infrastructure. So just like your onion, if you cut the onion, you'll find such slices or layers of them. So it will have the domain layer in the center, then the application layer or presentation infrastructure. This is simplest form of your, we can say, clean architecture. Now, if you want more complicated version, so you can have look at here. So we can have the entities, then we have the use cases, then we have the controllers, presenters, and the gateways. And at the top, we have the devices, web UI, external interface, and DB with that. Fine. Now, I'll keep the architecture simple because we want to focus on implementation of the, we can say, microservices, so the issue of clean architecture. So we'll go with this particular, we can say, slice. Now, so yeah, so let's implement it using Visual Studio. So at the first step, what we'll do, so we'll create one solution, and that solution will have the different layers like domain, application, infrastructure, presentation, fine. So we can create this layer, we can say project with that. Now the first project that we'll do, so let's start implementing it with the Visual Studio. So we'll go to Visual Studio here. Now at the first step, we'll create a blank solution. So I'll search for a blank solution here. And we'll select a blank solution and we'll keep everything inside this particular blank solution with us. So we'll say next here. You can also create multiple solutions, not a problem. But our, we can say domain is very small. Our scope is very small. So we'll create a single blank solution here. Now we'll put some name to this solution, something called Institute dot, let's say, Microservices. You can put any name, so keep the names meaningful and keep track of the names because it will create a conflict. Because when you put a name to something, it will create namespace by that name. So you should take care that your name should not conflict with the class names or built-in class names. Now, Institute.microservices, I'll put it into microservices folder here. So we'll say create. We'll create the blank solution here. Now, if you go to Solution Explorer, so it will be blank. Now we'll start adding the projects of that. So the first project that will add the domain. That's the heart of your, we can say, clean architecture. Now, so domain. So class library. So say entity. So domain project will be a class library type of project. So domain project will be a class library type of project. So domain project should be a class library type of project. Now it will have the entities, value objects, domain exceptions, and interfaces for domain services. Fine. So you can put all these things into this particular domain project with that. So it will have the entities, value objects, domain exceptions, and the interfaces for domain services with that. Now dependencies, so none. So domain will not depend on anything. So no NuGet packages, no entity framework, just pure C#. So it should be pure C# classes or C# with that. So it will not have any dependency. So here will not install any external dependency. It will not depend on any project or any NuGet package with that, even no entity framework, nothing. So quick beginning. For example, we can create a student class into a domain. Now, what we'll do here, so before going to that, I will tell you one more thing. So This is about a clean architecture, but where the clean architecture will fit, so it will fit inside your, we can say service, so inside your microservices there. Now, how we can fit that inside the microservices with that? So what we can do is, so what we have created a solution, so blank solution. And the blank solution will create, suppose a separate folder for every microservice, just to segregate those microservices from each other. So suppose I want to create a folder like something called student, we can say microservice here. So we'll create a folder for the student microservice here, the course microservices here. And in every folder, so we'll have here we'll have the student microservice implementation. Here we'll have the post microservices implementation, or we'll say enrollment microservices folder. So you can arrange it as per your requirements. So I used to arrange like this. So student microservices, course microservices, and these are the folders. Now in this we'll implement the student microservices, and to implement the student microservices, we are going to use the clean architecture. So here we'll have the domain project. Here we'll have the, we can say, your infra project. We have the application project. So whatever the project that we create inside the, we can say, clean architecture. So we'll put it inside this particular, we can say student microservices. Now, course microservices will have its own domain project, will have its own domain, infra project, drone application project of that. So it is with that. Now it will have its own. So enrollment service will have its own. So domain project, infra project, and application project of that. And here we are implementing the clean architecture. So here we are using the clean architecture. Now let's do this. So यहाँ पर सबसे पहले तो we'll create we'll go through the projects. So the first project is domain project at the heart. So it will be class library type of project. It will have the entities, value objects, domain exceptions, and interfaces for domain services. So dependencies none, no NuGet packages, no entity framework, just pure C# with that. So here we can create the student class. Now, so side by side we'll try to implement, but first we'll go to through this project here. So application. So second project that will add is application, that the orchestrator. So that will combine the we can say domain and infra together there. Now, so it will be again a class library type of project application. So it will have the DTOs, data transfer object. We if you had attended the web API, so you might think about the DTOs. So DTOs are just objects which will help you transfer data between repositories and services. Now use cases, command and query, if you are using CQRS pattern there. So right now we are not going to use the CQRS. We are implementing a simple service, and here we are going to implement synchronous messaging and auto-mappers if you want to do the mapping. So if you know attend the web API session, so you might know about auto-mapper will help you to do the object to object mapping. So object to object mapping. So right now we are not using auto-mapper. We are not using any CQRS pattern for initial demo. Later on, we'll add them. Now, dependencies, so only depends on the domain project. So application depends only on domain project. So application depends only on domain project. So it depends on the domain project. Here we have the, we can say, iRepository student interface or the register command, student command. If you are using a CQRS pattern, so it will have this register student command here. And if it will have the repository for the student. So it will have the repository for the student. Now, the infrastructure here. So next project that we'll do is infrastructure. Basically, the infrastructure. Now in the infrastructure, so infrastructure will be again a class library type of project, and it will have the technical details. Now it will be again a class library type of project, and it will have your database context, EF code, repository implementation. So here we'll have the repository implementations of that. Now file system access, email services, WhatsApp API, third-party APIs. So you will have everything in this particular project here. So that is called infrastructure. Now, dependencies, so depends on the application project to implement its interfaces. So infrastructure depends on the application project as well as sorry. So it will depend on the application project that and to implement the repositories of that. And now, so presentation. The presentation is your entry point of your application. It can be your web API project or MVC project with that. So it contains the controller, middlewares, program.c, dependency injection setup of that. Now it depends on the application and infrastructure. So it depends on the application as well as infrastructure project to register them in a DI container. So to register them in a DI container of that. So it depends on the application and infrastructure. So how it will create so code. So that will be your domain and application infrastructure. So persistent and shared. So presentation. So your web API or controllers in the middle. Okay. Now, so how we can create this here? So we can create this project like this. So from projects create कर सकता है. So API application domain and infrastructure application plus domain. Let me modify one thing here. So your infrastructure plus it needs the domain here. Now let's implement this step by step for, we can say, our student service. So the first project that we'll do is we'll create student service domain. Now to keep the services, we are using a single solution for all the services. Now to keep the services segregated from each other, so at the first step, I'll add the folder. So we'll add a folder here. We'll say Student Microservices. In this folder, we'll add the first project that is your domain. So we'll say add new item here. Sorry, new project, not new item. So we'll right click on the Student Microservices. We'll say add new project here. Now this will be a class library type of project. So what I'm going to do, so we are using ACE.NET Core here. So we'll select for the class library type of project in this bigger search box here. And here select the class library. So we'll use the target .NET or .NET standard. So .NET framework नहीं use करेंगे. So we'll use the target .NET or .NET standard of that. So class library type of project. We'll put some name to this. We'll say something called. So student services dot domain. Fine. We'll put some name to this pretty good project here. So 8.2. So I'm using a framework 8.2. That is the long-term support. Now I'll say create here. Now it will create a class library type of project here. Now I'll add the second project here. So that is your application. Then we can add the infrastructure and then we can add the API. So in the same folder, so say add and we'll say new item here. I will say class library type of project here and I will say so student services dot infra or I'll say infrastructure or you just say infra if you want to use the shortening. This is just a formality, so you can put any name as per your requirement, but those names should follow this particular thing. So what should be placed where? Now, next thing that we'll do is we'll create the new project, again, class library type of project. We'll say student services start, we'll say, so infra here, domain and infra. Now we'll have the application. Now, the next project that we'll add is something called ACE.NET Core empty project. So next project I'm adding is ACE.NET Core empty project here. So I'll say student services dot server API. So I'm going to use the API here. So I'll use without HTTPS. We'll say create here. So you got this 4 projects here. Now we'll add the dependencies. So your API depend on the application end. infrastructure. So API depend on the application and infrastructure. So two references we need to add here. Now, why so? That I'll tell you. So first we'll add only reference of application. So domain will be used in application and infrastructure. So application will be used in infrastructure, and we can say API will have the reference of application there. So or we'll do it step by step. We'll add the reference when we require. So when we require, we'll add the reference of that. Now at the first step, we'll go to domain project, and in the domain project, we'll start creating the entities of that. I'll add the entities folder here. And in this entities folder, so I'll create my student entity of that. Now it's a public and student entity here. Okay. So domain project, what we can do, so in domain project, we can create the entities, value object, domain exceptions, and interfaces for domain services. Fine. For domain services. Okay. Now I'll say int 64 here, and we'll say student ID. Student name, address, email ID, the mobile number. So you can add few more properties as per your requirement. I'll keep it simple. Okay. Now, so here we need to add the domain services also. So what I have told you about the domain services and application services before. So domain services will have you the logic. So they will not use the repositories. So application services will use the repositories plus domain service. So database plus domain service. Domain services will have the logic with that. So your business logic. Fine. For example, in enrollment service, so you want to validate whether the student has prerequisite completed. For example, you want to enroll to Azure course 2. So the prerequisite is, so you should have the completion certificate of Azure course 1. So this is called domain service, where we have the business logic, and application services where we can have combination of these two. And that is basically used to implement the use case. Now, second thing, what we can do in a domain project. So in a domain project, we'll create the interfaces to implement the repositories. So here we can create the interfaces for implementing the repositories also. Okay. So here we'll add one more project here. Sorry, one more folder. So we'll say repositories, or we'll say interfaces. Now in the interfaces folder, so we'll add interface to work with the student entity. So we'll say I student repo. So we'll put some name to this I student repo here. So this will be help you to implement your repository. So we'll say interface here. So what operations I want to put here? So I want to use the async await. So right now, Copilot is also generating this if you want to use that. Now, so I want to use the async await, and I want only suppose or implement all the operations of that. So first I need get all. So I'll say task of the I collection of student. And students is available in 90 days folder here. I will say get all. There's a task of. I hope all of you know async await asynchronous programming. So I'm using this. If you don't know, just tell me right now. So I will skip the async await. किसी को सिंक कवर से दिक्कत है, स्किप करना है तो अभी बोलो। ओके, चलो किसी को दिक्कत नहीं है। So it's a task of, so I want to return a single student by ID, and I want to add the student, and I want to return the added record. So newly added record, if you want to return that, you can return, or you can just return the ID. Now, if you want to implement other operations, you can implement here. Okay. So it will have only interface, not the implementation of that interface. Now I'll do the implementation in a infra. So infra can उसको implement करेंगे. So the next project that will work is the infra. So in infra, we'll need a EF4 and repository implementations and all other things. So that's all the stuff that we need here. Now in infra, so we need a domain. So to implement the repository, so we need a domain. So the first step that we'll do, I'll add the reference of domain in the infra. So I'll go to the project reference here and I'll add the reference of the project domain here in the infra. Now, second thing, so we'll have the EF core here. So we'll install all the packages that required for the entity framework core. So I'll go to NuGet package manager here. I'll search for EF core. I'll say Microsoft entity framework core here. So I'll say install here. Then we'll install the relational package here. Then say design. Sorry, design we don't need here. This is SQL Server. I'm matching the project version. If you're using latest 10.0 framework, so then you can use the 10.0 framework packages. Then. Now we need the tools for the migration. I'll say install here. Okay. Now, so in infra, so the first thing that we'll do is we'll create database folder. Or if you want, you can create a context folder. अगर आपको database confusing लग रहा है, तो it's a context here. And the context folder, so we'll have your DB context class. So you will say something called institute context. And this institute context will have the DB context. It will init from the DB context here. And here we'll have the constructor and we'll create DB set type of property for student. And for the student, we need the reference of domain. So domain project reference here. So it's a domain.entities. And here we'll say something called students. Okay. Now the second thing that we'll do is we'll implement the repositories here. So I'll create a folder repositories. And the repositories folder, so we'll add the class to implement I student repo. We'll say student repository. Now I'll say public here. And we'll implement I student repo here. And instead of student repository, we'll also keep the naming in sync. So I'll make it repo here. Now I'll implement this repo, and to implement this repo, so we need the context. And we have the context here. So we'll ask for the object of context, something called institute context here. And we'll say public student repo, and here we'll say institute context. Now I'll implement the add method here. So I'll say this dot context dot, we'll say add student. And we'll say await this dot context dot save changes async. Now you can also await this operation because we have the async version of this, and we'll return newly created object here. Now also delete. So for delete, we'll first find we can say student, then we'll say something called if not null, then we'll say return true, otherwise we'll return the false here. We'll remove that and we'll call the save changes async here. Now it's a return await. This dot context dot student to list async method the part of continuous framework code. So we need this particular package here. Now it's a return this say this dot context dot student dot. So we'll make it await here. And if you use the await method in any function, that function should be async. So it's automatically adding the async keyword here. Here it didn't, so we had added it manually. Now you'll say this dot will say students or will say context dot students dot update student, and here will say await, and will return the updated student here. And we'll say something for async here. Now, sometimes you may get this green underlines everywhere. हर जगह green underlines आपको दिखेंगे. Now that the feature of ASP.NET, .NET Core 8.0, 7.0 onwards, I think so. Now it will warning you regarding the null. So if you put the cursor, it's show you the context is not null here. So possible null reference rated. So if you want to avoid those warnings, you can every time you need to do this. Now instead of doing this, so if you want to disable these warnings, so what we can do, so we can go to the right click on the project where you want to disable this particular warning. So that now it's edit profile project file here. So edit project file, and in the edit project file, so we'll go to the nullable tag here, and in the nullable tag we have the enable. So we'll make it disable. So as soon as you make it disable for a specific project, so it will stop checking for this, and you will not get this green underlines everywhere. Now, if you want, actually, it's a good feature, so it will give you the warning regarding nullable. If you want to keep it on, you can keep it. Now, so next thing that we'll do is we'll implement the repository. Now, I want to use this repository in your application project here. So I'll go to the application project, and what we do in the application project, and the application project will create the DTOs that is required to transfer the data, and it will have the interfaces for reporting and services. We'll not create the repository interfaces here, so we'll create the service interface. So if you want to use the create your services loosely coupled from each other. So right now I don't want that. If you want, we can. So we'll create it. We'll create it, no problem. So we'll create the repository interfaces basically in a domain here. So here. Fine. Because it will have the, so this interface will help you. Interface means rules. So the rules will be forced to you. And whatever the business rules that we have, so we'll put it into our domain services in a domain layer. Now, so what we can do is, create a DTO. So first step that we'll do in application, we'll create a DTO. So we'll add the folder here. And in this folder, we'll create the DTOs folder. In the DTOs, your domain is not exposed directly to a presentation. Your domain is not directly exposed to the presentation. If you look at this particular architecture, so domain is not directly exposed to the presentation. So application is exposed to the presentation as well as infrastructure or application or infrastructure exposed to your, we can say presentation with that. Now, the domain is not directly exposed to the, we can say presentation. So if data comes from the presentation, so it will come to the application, and from application, it will go to domain. Now in domain, we have the entity. So we need some kind of object which will help you to, we can say send the data from presentation to application, application to domain. So domain back to the application, application back to the presentation with that. So that data will be transferred with the help of the special type of objects called DTO. So I'll create the DTO. So I want to transfer entire student information from the presentation to application to application. So we'll create a student DTO. So right now I will focus on create. So I'll create the name with student create DTO. I'll create the create student DTO here. So we'll have the create student DTO. And we'll create the property that we want to communicate. So we don't need a student ID here. To create the student, we don't need student ID. Student ID will be automatically created here. So student DTO were created. So I want to communicate student name, address, email ID, and the mobile number. Fine. Now, if you want to communicate ID, so we'll create one more DTO. And we'll make it suppose just student DTO. And we'll inherit the student DTO from student create DTO. And we'll have some additional property here, something called in64 student ID here. And the student DTO, I want all the properties from the student create DTO, like name, address, email ID to be here. So I'll inherit it from the student create DTO. Okay. Now here we'll have the services folder where we'll actually implement the domain service, application services. So here we'll have the services. The application services are basically used to implement use cases. Sorry, not here in application folder. We'll put some name services here. Now this will have the application service. An application service implement the use case. So for example, enrollment is a use case. So in enrollment, what you need to do? So you need to, we can say, fetch the student data. You need to fetch the course data. Then you need to create the admission using that particular data. Then you need to send a message to the payment service. Fine. And to retrieve the student data and the course data, so it will need to talk to, we can say, service of that. So that is the use case. So for use case, we'll create the application service. But when we create a domain service, we'll create domain service for business logic, just before I told you. So when we do the enrollment, so we should check whether when student enroll for the Azure Post 2, so it should have Azure Post 1 certificate with that. It should be completed that particular training. So that is the domain service. And domain services we implement in a domain project with that. Now, yeah, so we'll create the services, and in the service we'll add the class. So if you want to use the interfaces, so you can use the interfaces here. If you want to use the interfaces, you can use the interfaces. If you don't want to use the interface, you can skip it. Fine. So the situation is like this. So that the services can be upgraded at any point of time inside your application. Then I will recommend to use the interface of that, because that will help you to create the next version of the service and inject it using a dependency injection directly inside your, we can say, API of that. And if you are sure that this service is not going to change, this use case will not be upgraded, or this use case will not have a next version of that, then you don't need to create an interface. Fine. Now let's create the interface. No problem at all. So I'll show the implementation with interface. I'll give one more, or what we'll do. Okay, no problem. We'll create the interface here. So new item, and we'll say interface. So you will say something called iStudent service. And this interface will have the use case implementation. So what I want to do right now, so I want to display all the records. So you may feel this is exactly similar to your repository interface with that, but that is not the case every time. So we are doing very small scenario. So that's why you will feel that this is different. This is similar with your repository interface, but it will not. But it will not. Your services interface will have the methods or rules that will be used by the use cases. Fine. So you can create all these things here. So if you want, you can say get all, get by ID, create student, update student or delete student if you want. If your use case demand only these two things of them, you can do that. If your use case demand only these two things, you can create these two things. That depends on the use cases. So that's why I had told you, I had shown you one complex scenario. So here we have the use cases. Fine. So right now, so I want only these two things. So that's I'll say get student by ID. I will change the name and I'll say add student here. And get student by ID will give you the student detail as the rating type. And add student will use the create student detail as a parameter here. Now let's implement this service here. Apply the student service here. Now it's a public student service and we'll implement our student service here. And we'll have the implementation. And for this implementation, so what we need the repository. Fine. So we need the repository. So we need the repository of them. Now, so what we need, so I need the I student repo here. So I need I student repo, and I student repo is available in domain. So it's available in a domain. It's available in a domain. Now you can ship this interfaces to an infrastructure project if you want, but that is not recommended because it's rules and rules will put in domain here. Now, so we'll go to the application project. At the first step, what we'll do, so we'll add the we can say reference of a domain project. So we'll get the project here and we'll get the reference of a domain here in the application. And from domain, we'll go get this particular iStudent repo. And here we'll say repo. And we'll ask this using the constructor injection. Now in iStudent, what we'll do, so we'll say something called this dot. So repo dot will say add new student. And here you can use the auto mapper. So you can use the auto mapper. So what we'll do, so we'll add the auto mapper tomorrow. So we are out of time right now. So I'll do the manual mapping here. So to add, we need object of student. So for the student, we are already using a domain project here. So we'll add the reference of domain entities. We'll say rec and we'll say new student here. And we'll do the mapping. So we'll do the member by member copy from the DTO to your actual entity. Yeah, high image. Now we can automate this mapping using automapper. So we can automate this mapping using automapper. So right now we are doing manual mapping. Then we'll add the rec here, and it will return you one result, and we'll send this result back. And to call this add method, we'll use the await. And when we use the await, so it should be async. Okay, now you need to do the mapping again because the return type of this particular, we can say thing is student detail. So return type is student detail. So we need to map this RES to students. So what we can do, so we can use the automapper. Automapper पता है क्या use करें? Manual mapping करते हैं यहाँ पर. So it's a where something called result equal to. So we'll say student detail here and we'll return the result. Now get student by ID. So it's a return. I will first get the result here. This dot repo dot get by ID. And we call it using await because it's async. And when you call it using await, your service should be async here. And I want, so we need to map it to student DTO because we return the student DTO here. Now your domain is ready. Now I'll use this domain in an API. So we'll use this domain in an API. So in API, we'll use the domain and infra. So why we need infra, that I'll tell you. So first we'll use the application, sorry, not domain, application in API. We'll add the reference of the project here. So we'll say add a project reference and we'll use the application. So we'll use the application. Now in API project, so what we'll do, so at the first step, we'll add the controller. Now in the controllers, we'll add an API controller. We'll say student API. And the student API, so I need a student service. So I need the object of a student service, and that's why we had added the reference of application here. And we'll ask the instance of the student service using a constructor injection. And the first step that we'll do is we'll say, actually, we had implemented only one service, get by ID. So around all the students also. So we'll implement one more service in application layer. And we'll go to the services. I'll go to the interface here. And we'll say task of I collection of student DTO. So it's the get all students here. This will be a little challenging. Okay, no problem. So we'll implement this. We'll say sync and we'll say where R is equal to await. So repo.get all. But we cannot return this RES, so we need to convert it to, we can say, map to the student DTO. So how we are mapping here? So we are using a select method of link, and in this method we are telling transform the RES data, transform the RES data into a student DTO. So transform the RES data into student DTO and then get the list and we'll say return the result here. Okay. Now, so we'll say HTTP get and we'll say public and we'll say sync and we'll say task of get all students here and we'll call the student service and we'll return the OK here. Now, suppose we'll create one HTTP post method here. I'll say public async and here will say task of action reader task student. So we need the DTO and we'll get the DTO from application. So we had already added the reference of application for it here. Now, if you want to apply the validation and you can apply that. Now, these two, so we had consumed the application services in your API. Now, let's register these dependencies. We'll go to the program.cs. At the first step, we'll say public, we can say services.add controller service. And then we'll say app.map default controller out, sorry, map controllers. We are using API. Now register the services. So builder.services.add scope student services. So we'll register this dependency. Now I'll register one more dependency. So we need to register one more dependency. So before that, we'll register one more dependency. Which one dependency? RDB context. Fine. And we'll add the context here. But your so context is in which project? So your context is in an infrastructure project. So we need to add the reference of infrastructure. So infrastructure in your, we can say API. So we'll go to the API project here and we'll add the, we can say, reference of infrastructure here. So we'll get the institute context. And what we need, so we need to pass here and we read the connection string. So I'll create the connection string. We create the connection string in the API project. So we'll put the connection string SCON here. Server name. So I'll copy the server name from SQL Server. So student DB will put the database name. So we are not having user ID password here. So we'll use the we'll go to the database. I'll copy the server name here. Now, beside this service, so we also need to register the repositories. I-student repo, student repo. So for I-student repo and student repo also, we need the infrastructure. तो एक छोटी सी प्रॉब्लम है इसमें, तो उसको हम कल सॉर्ट कर लेंगे. फिलहाल हम आगे जाते हैं. Now I'll add the migration here. We'll say add dash migrations. I'll say init if everything is right. So it will help you to execute this command. We'll execute the migration command on infrastructure project because your context is in the infrastructure. So we'll select the infrastructure project from here. First step. Second step, we'll set the API project as a startup project. So you need to do this. So API project will be a startup project. And to add the migration, so we'll select the infrastructure project from here. Still, it will get you one more error. Add migration, we'll say init. Okay. So you'll get this error. So what this error is saying, you need a design package. So to work with entry framework tools. So to work with the entry framework tool. Now what is the problem? The problem is our connection string is in a API, context is in a infrastructure, and we are registering the DB context in API. So it's not able to find out where the context and it's not able to use the entity framework tools from infrastructure project into API because API is a startup project and API has the connection string. So that connection string will be used by the update migration command to force the changes in database for that. So what we need to do to resolve this particular thing, so we need to install one package called Microservices framework core.design in API project to that. So we'll right click on the API project and we'll say add, and we'll add one packages. So manage NuGet packages here. And manage NuGet packages, we'll say we'll go to the EF core. And EF core. So I'll install the package. So entity framework core.entity or design, entity core.design. So here we'll match the version. We'll say install here. We'll say accept. Okay. Now I'll do the migration here. Okay, so let me check. Let me check the connection string. I think connection string is problem. Yes, we have the problem here. Double quotes. So I also update database here. Office connection string is problem. This one equal to server equal to laptop, this and database equal to student DB, trusted connection equal to true, and trust server certificate equal to true. Now database is ready here. Now let's run the project. So after running this project, so what we can do, so we can access only get method from the browser. So for post method, so we need something here. So why it's saying invalid object students? Migration नहीं हुआ क्या? No migration applied, database is already up to date. Okay. So there is some issue with the migration. Let me check with the database here. We can go to the infra project and we'll some problem. So I'll delete this database here. Let me check the method. Okay. ये ऑलरेडी स्टूडेंट डेटाबेस बन चुका होगा किसी एग्जाम्पल में. Okay. तो अभी इसको रन करते हैं, एक बार डेटाबेस में भी जाके देखेंगे. Now we have the students. But यहाँ से हम कौन सा कॉल कर सकते हैं? So we can call only, we can make a get call. And get call में फिलहाल आपको कुछ नहीं मिलेगा because your database is blank. Now how to make a post call? So you call, so you can use the postman or we can use the Swagger. So let us use the Swagger. So how we can use the Swagger? So we'll install the Swagger packages in the API project. We'll search for the Swagger. So let's say ASP.NET Core Swagger package. So the first package that will install is ASP.NET Core Swagger. Swagger Gen. ये हमने web API में देखा. Then Swagger UI and swashbuckle.ASP.NET Core. So that is the open API implementation. ये थोड़ा चेंज हो गया है लेटेस्ट वर्जन में 9.10.2 के अंदर इट हैड मेड सिंपल आपको सिर्फ ओपन एपीआई को ही एक्टिवेट करना है. Now, yeah, so we need these packages. So the first service that I'll register here is SwaggerGen for API Endpoint Explorer. So first service. And second service that will do is something called SwaggerGen. Then we'll inject two middlewares in the request pipeline. So it's a use Swagger and use Swagger UI. Now I'll run this. So I'll say API slash current API. So we'll get the empty. Now I'll hit the Swagger endpoint. And to get to Swagger UI, so where from we can make the get and post request. Let's create a student by making the post request here. And mobile number here. Say execute. If everything is fine, so it will get you the newly created instance as a response body. And if you make the request to get all, so you get this. Okay. So our first microservice is ready. So we have created this. It has few problems for that. So that will solve tomorrow. What are the problems that I'll tell you tomorrow? And we'll try to introduce auto mapper. So instead of telling the link to do the mapping every time and to do the manual mapping, we'll add the auto mapper for the mapping with that. This mapping, object to object mapping. So here we want to map the student object to student DTU. So list of student DTU. And here we want to map the student object to student DTU as well as create DTU to student DTU. So we can use the auto mapper for this. So we'll use the auto mapper in tomorrow's session. And there's some small issues here that we'll solve tomorrow. And then we'll have the course service. And in the course service, then we'll do the enrollment and then we'll do the synchronous message communication between the services. So you got an idea. So your service is independent. It will have its own database. It will have its own bounded context. It will have everything on its own and it executes on its own. Fine. तो आज इसको यही छोड़ रहे हैं. So इसमें कोई डाउट है, क्वेरी है तो